had left off talking about Dutch Baroque art in Holland in the 17th century. And one of the things that we've been talking about was that art in Holland is different than the Catholic countries because they're Protestant. And in particular, that means that the Council of Trent means nothing to them, right? The Council of Trent was a council, when we saw how much that sort of interest in drama, right, in the lives of the saints as teaching tools for the faithful, how that was important for Spain and for Italy, right, Flanders, all these Catholic countries, but the Dutch are Protestants. They don't care about that, right? Because they're not following the Pope or the Church, the Catholic Church's ideas. And because they're Protestant, we see far fewer images of the lives of the saints. We see far fewer pictures of saints as role models. We see, because they're of the kind of Protestantism, because they're Calvinists, we see a much more kind of restrained Baroque. Not as flashy, not as overly dramatic, right? We might see the influence of Caravaggio here or there, but it's sort of less operatic, less over the top than the other countries in Europe at the time. The other thing that we saw was with the prosperous economy in Holland in the 17th century, the incredibly prosperous economy in Holland. We see more art there than almost any other country. And the reason is more people are buying it. So instead of art being made for a few very aristocratic patrons, plus the church, right, and its hierarchy, we have art being made for shopkeepers, shoemakers, bakers, right? And so we have a huge amount of art that survives from the 17th century. And with this working class clientele, right? People who are more concerned with the bottom line. One of the things that we see in Holland is an interest in, this is something Daniela was just asking me about, an interest in description. In art that is incredibly well observed and very, very detailed in its description of the artifacts that we see, whether it's landscape or still life, right? Very, very descriptive. And part of it is this patronage, this clientele. Part of it is Calvinism and its sort of down-to-earth nature. Part of it is that this is the region where Jan van Eyck used to work, here and in Flanders. And so that kind of detailed precision that we saw with Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden also carries through the centuries, right? So we had left off looking also then about artists who specialize. To corner one part of this vast market for art, Jacob van Ruisdael as a landscape painter, exclusively, right? Judith Leister doing these merry companies, revelers and whatnot. Frans Hals as a portraitist, making their money by cornering one corner of the market, doing that well. It's like the old adage that you don't buy sushi from a pizza place, right? Because they're probably not doing either of them very good, because they're trying to be all things to all people, right? You're going to get better sushi at a sushi house. You get better pizza at a pizza specialist, right? Dutch artists are kind of with that market sensibility. So we had already discussed, looking at Van Ruisdael's landscape, the possibility that this very detailed, closely observed, very naturalistic looking landscape might come front-loaded with metaphoric content. The idea of the passage of time, the idea of life as a walk in the woods, right? Life as a trek, as a pilgrimage of sorts, crossing the bridge to the other side, the dangers of the hard-to-see man in the shadows, right? The passing of time in the trees on the bluff, each a different stage of its life from full bloom to dying, right? But then the possibility also that there might be some religious content there, with the three trees resembling three crosses on a hill, the crucifixion of Christ. Not an image of Christ himself, but an image where we see God in landscape. God evident everywhere. Now with Haida's work, we left off sort of describing what we're seeing here, all these luscious materials, right? Very expensive meal. And I left you with this teaser about, well, is there metaphoric content here? And we tend to think, yes, that there is, right? So what we have is the very end of a meal. And there are ways in which the artist signifies that the meal is over. Well, most obviously, the food's mostly gone. Duh, right? Not the beginning, but the end. I could have not explained that to you. I could ask, is this the end of the meal or the start? And you could say, oh, well, there's, one slice of mincemeat pie left, right? Therefore, it's probably the end. The dishes are all upturned, right? But then there's these little subtle details, like the candle's been snuffed, right? The end of the meal. So we're at the very end of this meal, this very, very exotic meal that signifies to a Dutch audience an exotic meal, a sort of a special occasion kind of meal. And we were looking at some of the details that suggest the specialness of the meal, like the mincemeat pie, like the oysters, like the imported olives and lemons, right? One of the things this is going to lead us to now is not only the idea of, back up. Notice how that wonderfully drawn lemon rind, where you can see the difference between the pith on the inside and the rind on the outside, right? And you can almost feel the difference in those textures, right? The oiliness of the rind versus the dry bitterness of the pith versus the sweet, juicy part of the lemon, right? You can get the sense for all of that. And that Kleist is really good at describing the other textures, that pewter jug, the glass goblet, right? The wax dripping down the candlestick holder. And a pair of scissors that are used for not only snuffing the candle, but then trimming the wick immediately next to it, right? Notice how the rind of that lemon almost seems like it's dripping off the table, almost like it's asking you to touch it, right? And if you look at the front edge of the table, not only do we have that lemon with that rind sort of spilling down, but you notice that there's two dishes that come right out at you as well. They're not fully on the table, right? So as we move our eye toward the right, we see the bunched up piece of fabric. And then next to that, we see another pewter plate with two dinner rolls on it and a knife. And the knife handle is almost pointing at you. This is that Baroque thing we've seen again and again. You participate, right? Reach out, grab that knife. Caravaggio did it with the handles or the necks of violins and whatnot, right? Here we're seeing it with foodstuffs. But at the same time, there's something kind of precarious about it. Like the dish might fall off the edge. And that, I think, is the metaphoric content. That's sort of the key to the metaphoric content. Life's precarious. Life could end at any time. Your table could get upset at any point. Life could end, just like the meal did, at any particular point. So our snuffed candle here can really be seen sort of as a metaphor for the end of life as well. And that life itself is something that is precarious. We don't know when the end is coming, right? I guess unless you're on death row. But majority of people don't know when the end of life will come, right? And Claus's picture seems to suggest that life is fragile. And so the other plate with the little newspaper that's rolled up is for putting salt in. And you'd sprinkle the salt from the newspaper onto your meal. There's many empty oyster shells over here. But you'll notice that this plate is even more precarious, right? It's even further off the edge. And on top of it is a broken glass, right? We have two goblets here, one unbroken, one broken, shattered glass. Obviously, broken glass, a metaphor for precariousness, right? For danger, right? For fragility. So there is something underneath this that suggests these themes that we should remember that life is short. Now, what's the other point here? Well, life is short, and what do people say when they tell you, life is short? Hey, pay attention to the more important things out there. Stop partying all the time. Right? Alan Newt. And on a certain level, that's here. There's a sort of moralizing thing. Hey, life is precarious, life is short, you don't know when the end is coming, so take it easy. Right? And if we go back and look at the meal, you'll notice that they haven't licked their plates. They haven't finished every morsel of food on the table. There's a slice of mincemeat pie left. There's some olives left. There's some uneaten oysters. There's those 2 dinner rolls. Right? Everything in moderation. Right? Live your life in moderation. There's the underlying message here. Yes, there are times it's perfectly okay to have a sumptuous meal. Thanksgiving's a few weeks off, right? It's perfectly okay to have a sumptuous meal. But remember, life is short, and there are other things to pay attention to out there than pleasing your senses, than pleasing your body, right? So they come sort of front-loaded with this idea of the danger of life and a moralizing, right? Enjoy, but in moderation. Right? Again, I guess the other goblet, I don't really have to tell you this, but the other goblet sort of stacked precariously on the bottom of that salver, almost ready to roll off, could itself become broken as well, sort of just underscores that exact same message. Right? So what we saw with landscape painting and here with still life painting is that, again, there's these closely observed moments of everyday life. Very recognizable, very tactile, right? But at the same time, they come with some intentional lessons that one might ponder. Now, for us, we're so used to seeing pictures, paintings in museums. When we go, we see them as signs of wealth, objects of luxury. But you have to remember that that's a pretty modern way of looking at pictures. That people looked at pictures on the norm on their walls, in their houses, right? Not in museums. At least not until after the French Revolution did we have museums in the way that we think of them now. And in an era when they didn't have cell phones, television sets, and radios, right? Pictures became sort of centerpieces for conversation. You look, you ponder, you think, you reflect, right? You discuss. What do you think that might mean, right? So painters are often trying to give their pictures the potential to hold up to that sort of interaction, right? To the interaction where they could replace, sitting around watching YouTube, or whatever you choose to do with the end of your day, right? This is what they might have done, is to think about the meanings of these things. And sometimes they're left somewhat vague intentionally to specifically help push that along, right? So, specialists with front-loaded meaning. Our last speciality, if you will, is genre painting. We've talked about genre painting before, a type of painting that began around 1500, where we saw scenes of everyday life. Right? That's what a genre scene is. And with the Dutch, who are so much interested in these closely observed moments of daily life, you might expect they'd be pretty darned good at genre scenes, and they are. Right? And there are a number of different genre painters out there who specialize in genre painting. That's all they do. So Vermeer, for the most part, there's one or two images that there's one mythological picture, there's one biblical picture, and one landscape. The rest of them are genre scenes. And within them, they are single women alone inside, the vast majority, just like this one, right? Near a window in a sort of softly lit interior, right? Now, woman with a balance, what is she doing? Right, she's measuring, right? What do you do with a balance? You measure weight, right? What is she measuring the weight of? Exactly right, her jewels, right? So she's got her jewelry box open there, got a gold necklace and a pearl necklace, and they spill out onto the table. We've got another smaller box in front of it, and she's getting ready to weigh them. You'll notice that there's nothing in the pans, right? She hasn't actually put anything there. What she's right now checking is whether or not the scale works, right? Because a scale like this only works if the pans are equally balanced when they're empty, right? So she's really not, it used to be called women weighing pearls, but we realized, diving close, that there are no pearls there, right? She's getting ready to weigh pearls, okay? So it's a scene of everyday life. Now, does that kind of remind you of anything? We saw a man weighing gold before. Remember that with Quentin Matsys? We saw the gold weigher and his wife. And he was making sure that the things that he had, his possessions in this world, were worth what they said they were worth. So she's concerned, as a woman inside, with her material wealth. And as such, we've been thinking about somebody who's getting ready to check whether her material wealth is worth what it used to be worth, is worth what she thinks it's worth. That is a ripe, right? That's a field ready for metaphor. It's a field ready for allegory, right? She is thinking about the things of this world, but her face is so expressionless that the sort of judgment that we saw with Matsys seems a little bit more nuanced here. Because she has a sort of peace about her, right? That doesn't suggest maybe that she's distracted from things she should be doing, right? She might even be pregnant. We're not 100% sure. Vermeer's wife had like 14 kids. Yeah, she was a busy woman, right? And Vermeer he and his wife ran an inn, and he painted more or less on the side. There's only like 30 Vermeers in the world, 30 to 40 Vermeers, and we got 4 of them here in DC. Yes, right? We scored. And by the way, there's a Vermeer show up right now. Just opened like 2 weeks ago. We borrowed Vermeers from Paris and a couple of other places as well. So it's Vermeer and other genre painters. There's a nice genre show up right now at the National Gallery up through January. Right? It just opened. And this is kind of at the center of it. It's not been on our walls for a while because we loaned it to the other places where the show was hanging, right? Okay, so she's taking this moment to reflect, right, to think before she starts to weigh. And you get this sense in Vermeer's work, and this happens a lot, of a sort of a pregnant pause, of a quiet moment that could last forever. And so she's not really in the act of weighing yet. She's thinking, like maybe we should be, about what it all means, right? And Vermeer includes other little clues that seem to point to this idea of reflection, thinking about what this all means. You'll notice that she's right next to a window where she could look out. We can't see out the window, we just see the light coming in. What is that on the wall next to the window? No, over here. It's a mirror. Can you tell? Look at the light that hits the inside of the frame on the bottom, right? The Dutch in the 17th century did not put glass in front of their pictures like museums do, right? They weren't in the same business. They weren't protecting them in that way. So the shininess that we see there and the light that is reflected on the bottom of that wooden frame suggests that this is a mirror, right? So there's our symbol for reflection again, just like we saw in Matsys, where the mirror reflected out toward us, right? We don't see what's in the mirror, but she could look up and think about not just like her outward appearance, but herself, her character, right? So little elements that suggest this idea of reflection, of this moment when they're looking at material wealth and thinking maybe about, just like the still life, right? Take a second, pause and think about bigger things, right? Think about the state of your character, the state of your soul. Like preaching without preaching, right? Giving you these messages. Now, if we look behind her on the wall, the painting that's behind her, we can actually identify the artist. He did a lot of these. It's a Last Judgment picture. This is where Christ, here at the top, right, appears at the end of time to raise all of the souls from their graves, to separate the good people from the bad people. Right? The saved will come with Jesus to heaven, and the damned are going to be cast forever into hell. Right? The Last Judgment. And this is not in the Bible anywhere per se. It comes out of 4 or 5 different Bible verses. But it was a fairly common image in Christian art. And so that's about a 100-year-old painting on the wall. We think Vermeer probably owned it. He had a painting collection. And he puts it behind her here. And these are the souls rising from their graves down below. The ones on Christ's right side are the good ones. The ones on the bad side, his left side are the bad ones. And she's right in the center. So, again, like the scales, right? Which way is it going to go? We don't know. That adds now to this allegorical meaning. And what's really fascinating is that if you look at Last Judgment pictures in general, like I said, this one we don't know. We know other pictures by him. But directly beneath Christ, as he comes down to raise the souls from hell, there usually is St. Michael with scales, weighing souls, the good versus the bad. And her head is right where St. Michael should be in that picture. And she's the one that's weighing things, not souls, right? But this adds to this sort of really fascinating and somewhat complicated allegorical meaning of the picture, right? She should be thinking about the state of her soul and where it is in the pans of a scale. But instead, she's thinking about the value of her possessions. And that gives it this incredibly strong metaphorical content. Right? There's a close-up. So you can see the poor damned soul. They is like, no, don't take me. And the good one over here, right? On the left is, I can't wait to get into heaven with Christ. So like I said, Vermeer did a lot of these kinds of pictures. Single women caught at home alone in a sort of solitary activity. This one's up at the Met. Really a terrific picture. But you can see the composition is really, really similar, isn't it? Right? That soft light cascading through the window, a woman caught. Now, what's she doing? You know, she's less obviously metaphorical. I'll get you in a second, Emma. Right? Less obviously metaphoric, but she's got, looking out the window, she's got this silver jug. There's a map on the wall, right? But you can see they almost look like they're painted in the same room, you know? And we think maybe they were, right? But this is Vermeer's specialty, right? Within genre, a particular kind of genre picture. Emma.
Is it the same woman?
That's what a lot of people would like to think, right? It's difficult to say because, of course, a painting is not a photograph, right? And we know if we look at Vermeer's pictures that there's a lot of changes that he makes from when he starts the composition to when he finishes, right? So we can look through x-rays that he's moved things around. In fact, this one you can see pretty clearly. There's a chair over here, and we sometimes see this chair. We see this chair here. It's got a lion's head on it, right? Can you see that on the back? There's a sort of a lion's head looking out at you. That finial that's like this there's the nose of the lion, okay? And this leather-covered chair with the bracket, it appears in a lot of Vermeer pictures, right? But originally in this one, you can still see the ghost. It was here, facing that way. And there's the head. And there was the rest of it here. And as he was working, he decided that it's too busy there in the foreground, and I'm going to move it over here, right? So, going back to your question, are these the same women? Is it his wife? There's a temptation to say that. Hell, there was that movie, The Girl with the Pearl Earring, was all about that, right? That these are his wife and the girl with the pearl earring is not, right? I didn't see it, but that sort of stuff drives me nuts. But in any event, could well be, at the same time, the face is not all that similar. I don't think, the more you look at it. Yeah, the bonnet, I get all of that. And notice, by the way, how terrific he is at getting that starchy fabric and how the light hits one side and then kind of comes through it and is translucent on the inside. Really sweet. I love Vermeer. Vermeer is why I do art history. I kid you not. I was a studio art major, taking art history courses. I had this professor had to take upper division art history. I took Baroque and I liked Vermeer. And I did this paper, and she talked to this department chair, and they said you should go to graduate school. And I said, okay, where should I go? I like Dutch Baroque, and they said you should go to NYU. They do good Dutch Baroque. So I went there, and the guy who taught 17th century, he died just a few weeks ago. I hated him. So I ended up doing 15th century with Jan van Eyck instead. But Vermeer is the reason I went to grad school. Right? I think he's fantastic, right? I'd find these pictures, I could stare at them for days. I could live with one of these so easily. They're not very big, they're about like yay. Right? So, same woman, maybe, like I said, she's pregnant 14 times, and it looks like, obviously that's not his favorite body type, right? It's not like he's made her look just like something. But when I say that a painting's not a photograph, tempted not to say this at all, but there's a school of scholars out there that think that Vermeer used a lens of sorts to project the image onto his canvas and sort of traced what he saw, right? He used what was called a camera obscura, a large room with a lens. And if you've ever seen one of these work, right, they're pretty terrific. They're really kind of cool. It's very easy to do. You blacken all the windows, put a pinhole, and you'll get projection on the far wall or whatever's out there, right? There's no proof, but there's some thought that he used one of these, right? And it doesn't account for the changes he makes while working, right? But what's interesting when it comes to lenses is he's working in the city of Delft, D-E-L-F-T, right? Delft is famous for blue and white pottery, but Delft is also famous in the 17th century for being the home of the man who invented the microscope, Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. And Anthony van Leeuwenhoek's name, his baptism, is recorded on the same page of the church records as Vermeer's. They were neighbors, right? So he knows about optics, he knows about lenses, right? So it's an interesting thing. So when I say his painting isn't a photograph, there are some people out there who would like to argue that they're as close as you're going to get in the 17th century to being one. I don't buy it, right? I really don't. Because again, the technical information suggests that that's not really the way. He's very deliberate and slow in the way that he works, right? But I think he knew what kind of effects they would make, right? Okay. Does that get to the question?
Absolutely.
And then some. It's way too much, right? Okay. One more of these. I just love this picture, right? This is in Amsterdam. There's a nice little foot warmer back there with a pot for coals. She's pouring milk. And he even has figured out, like, when you pour milk slowly or pour any kind of fluid, when it comes out of the pitcher, it turns in space, right? In the same way that toilet water does, right? But in small. And he figured that out, right? Just by looking, he's captured it. It looks so terrific, right? And again, tactile stuff that Daniela was asking about, those breads, right? What a great country bread that is, Good and toothy and seedy. But also then the different kind of textures we have everywhere we look. The brass flower funnel in the back, the wicker basket. And again, sort of each one of these women is in the middle of a mundane everyday activity and pauses to think about it for a second. Right? What does it mean to be alive? And I think that's what makes Vermeer's work so incredibly special. Right? He's not the only one doing genre scenes of everyday life. And this image by Peter de Hoek, double O in Dutch is O, right? Not Ooch, right? Ooch is bathtub gin. Peter de Hoek, right? Also, just a moment, a frozen moment of everyday activity. A mother making up the bed. The daughter, I think it's daughter, comes in, interrupts her. There's this quiet moment of interchange. Nothing's being said, right? It's just, but now is there some sort of metaphorical content? I've got another mirror on the wall.
The chair.
There's an empty chair here, but what does that mean? Does that mean there's somebody that was seated there, right? We have a landscape painting up here. Landscape paintings and open windows usually suggest a family member who's gone away, But do they here, or is it just really taking pleasure in the everyday? Right? These are questions we can't really answer, right? So here's the mother, beautiful look on her face. The Dutch had such small houses that they usually had these built-in beds, right? So you just cover them up on the wall, and they just be part of the wall, and usually built into other rooms that could be used for other things when you're not sleeping. So here she's airing out the sheets, right? As the daughter has come in. Notice the interest in the different textures. The floor that they're standing on is this unglazed terracotta that has worn smooth in some areas, so it reflects a little bit, but not nearly as much as the glazed tiles in the next room. And that's because the next room out which leads to the backyard, is the mud room. And you want that to be glazed because it's easier to mop than terracotta, which would stain. Right? So she's come through, the little girl has these two separate doors to come inside. And here she is, she's got a little ball in her hand. And I say her, I don't know. I really don't know if this is a girl. I don't know clothing from the 17th century well enough to know if this is a girl or a boy. Right? Scraggly hair, but just, cute as the dickens. And probably been playing golf. Did we talk about this, right? Did we talk about this? Golf, the Dutch version of golf, which is basically a big flat surface, and you put a pin at the other end, and you try to hit the pin. It's a little bit more like shuffleboard, right? Or bocce or something, right? But you play them, you hit it with a stick, and you flat surface you can find. And they used to play it on the streets, and then they outlawed it on the streets because kids were knocking the ball through the window, right? So they started playing it on ice instead, right? Well, she's got a golf ball there, and looks like there's a little golf field out back for playing, right? Taking a moment, come in to say, Mommy. Now, maybe there is some metaphoric content here. Maybe less heavy-handed than the woman with the scales. Maybe less judgmental than that. Because in many ways, what we have is a woman doing work and a youngster playing. And they've converged, work and play. Can you see where this is beginning to head? A time for everything. Right? The mother is very dutiful. The mother is dedicated to her chores. She's an example of domestic virtue. The little child wants her to play, and there's the sense maybe that what Mom is saying, they're in time for that right now. I've got work to do. That not all life is play, but there's time for that. Just not right now. So much more subtle ways in which these pictures can convey meaning, right? They are scenes of everyday life, and there is a joy in just looking at the simplicity of our world, the beauty of things, right? Paintings within a painting, different textures, different building materials. Gosh, the way that light comes through the window and hits the back wall, having been sort of magnified as it comes at an angle through the glass and gets sharpened onto the wall, right? Again, the mirror. He's in the same city as Vermeer. They probably knew each other's works pretty well, right? Suggesting reflection, thinking about your own self, right? But at the same time tempered with this joy in looking at stuff. Particularly, you can see in this detail, right? This wasn't in my notes. Right? There's that one nail in the wall. Can you see it there? Right? Just something was hanging there once, and it's not hanging there now. Right? He's just included it as, again, this interest in looking at stuff. Right? So this is Dutch Baroque art. It's very, very different from Italian Baroque, Spanish Baroque. We haven't looked at French yet. Even in Flanders, which is right nearby. Very, very different from those. We haven't yet looked at the single greatest artist, the single most famous artist from the Dutch Baroque period. That's Rembrandt, right? We're on a first-name basis with him, right? We know him better by his first name than his last name because his last name means that he came from a region, the Rhine region, Rembrandt van Rijn. And so well known that he's a toothpaste, right? You've heard of him before. It's one of those, I could probably say, name 5 artists you've heard of before you ever took this class, and his name might be on that list, right? He might not spell it right, but his name might be on that list. Right? He's just that well known. And certainly the most important, historically speaking, the most important artist in 17th century Holland. He spent his entire career in Amsterdam. He moved to the city of Amsterdam, the capital of Holland, when he was 22 years old. At this point, it's about 30 years later, he's 53. And as you might guess, the years have not been all that kind to him. He looks pretty, I'd like to think he looks pretty horrible for 53. I'm 57, right? And I don't think I look, today I feel like I'm that tired, right? But the years were pretty tough on old Rembrandt. A lot had happened to him by this point, much of it of his own making. He's about to declare bankruptcy at this point in his life. He'd spent all of his money. And there's something about him, this is, I think, is really what's particularly wonderful about Rembrandt, is the degree to which when he paints people, including himself, and he painted himself a lot, there are a significant number of self-portraits of Rembrandt. He doesn't try to make himself look better than he really looks. You know, oftentimes portraitists make themselves look really swank, right? Judith Leister with that amazing ruff as she's painting. You know, she's a noble woman. Think of how Velázquez made ugly Philippa Habsburg look, right? Rembrandt is honest. There's no sort of airbrushing here, right? This is what he looks like. And that is really one of his great strengths, is the way in which he observes his world and depicts it unfiltered. Very, very direct. And especially with himself. It's a nice close-up, right? He stares out at us, and you get the sense that you're not just looking at the surface of Rembrandt's face, although that's definitely part of what he's trying to get across, is the craggy surface of his skin. But you also get the sense that you're looking into his soul, that you see not what he looks like, but who he is. And he's going to present that to you honestly and directly. That this is now you've done it. This is a sad man toward the end of his life. Like, he died when he was 63, right? So he's about 8 years from life. He doesn't know when he's going to die. Nobody does, right? But there is this sense that here he knows he's gotten old, and that's what he's showing to us. So this is one of Rembrandt's amazing strengths, is his ability to characterize, right? His ability to focus on the humanity of whoever he's depicting. One of his other great strengths that we see in this picture, and we'll see in others as well, especially here toward the end of his life, is the vigorous way that he handles paint. Look at the paint surface. It's really incredible, right? And one of the things that he's particularly good with in handling paint is understanding how to lay down the paint on the surface in a way that evokes the three-dimensional structure of the thing that he's painting. Now, I'll try to explain this, right? Look at the strokes on his cheek here, how they come down in the same way that the structure of our faces come down, this direction, right? How he builds up more paint in a sort of circular motion on the end of that big old bulbous nose, right? How the paint for the eyebrows, above the eyebrows, but up here on this brow, actually follow the creases of the muscles, right, and the bulges of your forehead that you get from when you get older, and you get the life of scowling. You get those bumps above your forehead and up here, and the paint follows them, right? He's almost like he's sculpting in paint, and taking lots of interesting chances as well. For his hair over here, to get the highlights, he's probably bald, by the way. That's the one way in which he's a little bit vain. It's like you never see him without a hat, because we think that he didn't like being bald, right? So he grows the bozo hair, which my wife said if I ever do that, she'd slap me, right? Long hair on the sides and nothing on the top, and he comes up with a head so it looks okay, right? Like the lead singer for the Beach Boys or something like that. He was like 70 and still calls himself a boy, right? But his hair over here, he's laid down the hair, and then he took the brush and he turned it around to the butt of the brush. And to get the highlights of the hair, he came back into the wet paint and scratched at it. Can you see that right here? Right, that's all coming back into it, and that gives it that sense of the highlights on the hair as well. So he's a master at using paint, and what he's using it for, here's even a better close-up. Woo! Yeah? I know, is that a bit much paint?
It's just real bright.
It's bigger than your head. His eyeball is bigger than your head. But the way in which the paint is built up in all of these different layers, it leaves a little bit of that greenish brown under here, it goes back over the top of that. Here under his eye, there's a bit of red that's been brought in. And things you might not notice, right at first when you see it, but that help to give it that sense of a pulsing living individual, right? Of a character. And he's just such a terrific manipulator of paint, this thickness of paint in his life, right? So his use of the medium is one of his great strengths, but so is his ability to characterize, right? To understand and nail the inner life of the people that he paints. And for Rembrandt, this is important because what he wanted to be as a painter was a history painter. So he wanted to specialize in a particular genre, the genre of historical pictures. Pictures of biblical scenes, not just images of saints holding an attribute like, St. Lucy or something, but rather images of stories from the Bible. That's what he wanted to do. And that's what he did most of all. For Rembrandt, this is because it was the most important kind of painting. It was better than all the other paintings because you had to be a portrait painter, you had to be a still life painter, you had to be a landscape painter if you're going to paint historical scenes. You had to bring that all into it. That made it more expensive. He wants to succeed. So he uses his own face and he's interested in his face to understand character so that when it comes time to paint narrative scenes, he can characterize, right? He does a lot of pictures which are just models dressed up in clothing that he collected. He collected exotic clothes. Amsterdam was this major port city, right? Ships coming and going from all over, all the time. And Rembrandt collects costumes that he will use in his religious pictures. And he dresses people up in them just to study character. So in this case, this is a huge picture. It's 4.5 feet tall, right? It's a major picture, maybe 5 feet tall, right? The guy's roughly life size. And it was made specifically as a study of character and costume. That's all. Posed specifically for that, so that when Rembrandt wanted to do a religious picture, he could without having to pose models. He had it in a database, if you will, in his head. So he would get people off the street to pose for him. He'd dress up his wife in costume. This is Saskia, his wife, Saskia van Allenburg. Shortly after they married, dress her up in these sort of quasi-exotic, made-up costumes that would allow him to become familiar with how headdresses like that fell off the shoulders, how jewelry looped around the chest, right? That's the whole point of doing these, right? All to prepare himself for painting historical pictures. Now, a bit about Saskia, especially when we think about poor Rembrandt looking so sad at this point in his life. She's dead by this point. He outlives her by quite a few decades. Saskia was the daughter of a prominent art dealer. And it seems as if when Rembrandt got married, he did it, at least at first, as something of a business transaction. What a great thing for a young artist in the big city to be married to the daughter of an art dealer. Right? Rembrandt can use this to help market his works. And it certainly sounds like an arranged marriage. And in addition to that, her family was incredibly wealthy. Rembrandt was the son of a mill worker. right? Rembrandt was poor and an artist, no less, right? So she brought a dowry. She brought an inheritance. And her father knew that this was a bit of a risk. So there was even a caveat that if Rembrandt ever remarried, he would have to give the dowry back to the family. Right? So Rembrandt's marrying up the social ladder and marrying somebody, Saskia, who can actually help his career. And his career seems to have flourished in Amsterdam in the early years. But it wasn't just an arranged marriage. They loved each other, like deeply, deeply in love. And that's rare. Most marriages are arranged. Up until the 20th century, most marriages were arranged and not about love. It's one of my favorite Rembrandt pictures. This is Rembrandt as the prodigal son. And he's got Saskia on his wife, on his lap, as the hooker from the house of ill repute. And here he is. This is great. He just got married. He's been married for like 2 years now, right? And he paints, how would Dad feel about this? He paints him as the prodigal son. This is the metaphor, right? The prodigal son inherits all this money, he goes out and he spends it all, right? And then he's welcomed back into the loving arms of his dad at the end of it. He spends it all on gambling and on hookers, right? And here we see Rembrandt in this early self-portrait as the prodigal son in the act of losing his inheritance, which Saskia's dad had just given him, right? And there's Saskia as a harlot in this lab. And it's just so joyful, it's funny, right? And they're having, look at we talked about mincemeat pies, look at that pie, that's a peacock pie, where the head of the peacock is on the crust, on the outside of it, which is fairly common, on the table, and there's the knife coming off the edge of the table to us to participate. And he's got that great glass. We see these in a lot of Dutch pictures. See the lines on the glass? Here and here. There's these bands. It was a drinking game. You took the glass and you tried to drink it down right to one of the lines, right? And if you did, then you win. I don't know what you won, right? And he didn't win, right? He missed the lines. He doesn't care. He's just drinking for drinking, right? But he's got that game glass in his hand. Right? So anyway, Rembrandt and Saskia seem to have hit it off amazingly. And then in 1639, she got tuberculosis. And she was bedridden for 3 years before she finally died. This is Saskia here in bed, sick and looking out at us. This is an etching. It's another printmaking medium. We'll talk more about it in a little bit. But this is one of the first major heartbreaks in Rembrandt's life. So when we look at this self-portrait from the end of the 1650s, 17 years later, Rembrandt has had a very difficult life. Remember, he also can't remarry, right? He has affairs, but he can't remarry because of the terms of the wedding, right? So Rembrandt's life is somewhat difficult, right? And it shows through the years. He presents himself again as a character, if you will, honest illustration of what he truly feels inside. Now, that characterization is something that Rembrandt brings to all of his pictures, not just his self-portraits, right? All of his pictures have that deep understanding of humanity. And that is what people, when they talk about Rembrandt being one of the great artists of all time, that's one of the things they talk about with him, is his understanding of human nature, of character. And when he does narrative scenes, he brings that same understanding. So this is roughly the same time as the self-portrait. One of the things he was interested in addition to portraits of people around him dressed up in fancy clothes, he also did a number of images of the people, the beggars in his neighborhood. So we see two different pairs on the left. We flip the sheet 90 degrees. We see another one on the right, upper right corner. And these studies of people, right, walking around the streets, these facial types become the actors in his painted plays, if you will, right? So here on the left, a religious picture, if you will, a mythological picture. When we talk about history paintings, all of these things come under the umbrella of history paintings. They can be real history, like Roman history, right? Or they can be Greek mythologies, or they can be biblical pictures, right? These all fall under the mantle of historical pictures. So here's a mythological picture, Philemon and Baucis. Now, what artist influenced this, do you think? Say it louder, Emma. Caravaggio, exactly. Rembrandt loves the Caravaggio effect, right? Ochres, right? Earth colors, browns, oranges, yellows, right? Incredibly deep lighting that all but obscures the interior, although Rembrandt's pretty good about leaving us lots of things to look at back there that structure the rest of the canvas, right? He doesn't necessarily have Caravaggio's spotlighting. We have a fire in the lower left corner, and we see some light coming from behind the head of the younger man at the table. But it still resembles very much Caravaggio. Right? Now, Rembrandt never left Holland. He may have seen one Caravaggio at a sale. We know he saw a Raphael because he made a sketch of it. Right? But he may have seen a Caravaggio as well. If he's getting Caravaggio, he's getting it secondhand. Right? In the same way we talked about Judith Leister being a second-hand Caravaggio follower. Right? How many of the Spaniards, Velázquez, was a second-hand Caravaggio follower. He's not looking at Caravaggio's works. He probably never saw Caravaggio. Right? He saw other artists who saw Caravaggio. Right? He's getting it secondhand. And his works throughout most of his career do channel some elements of Caravaggio. Not only in his paintings, but also we'll see in his prints. Right? Now, what's our story here? This is a Roman myth. Comes out of Ovid, who wrote often about Roman gods. Talks about the fact that Zeus and Hermes came down from heaven and were looking for a place to sleep. But they were traveling incognito, right? Nobody could recognize them. They weren't revealing their divine character, right? And as they went from door to door, all of the rich people locked their doors and said, "No, we have no room." And then they come to the barn owned by this poor couple, Philemon and Baucis. They're on the left-hand side of the table. Right? And they took them in immediately. Right? So it's all about sort of, stodgy rich people and more human poor people is the story, right? And they take them into their cottage and they give them what little they have, right? Not knowing who they are, out of just the goodness of their hearts. And they give them this meal, and they start to pour them the last of their wine. They got like a bottle of wine left, and they start to give them the last of their wine. So if you look, Baucis, or not Baucis, but Hermes here, there's a little glass of wine there on the table. Maybe see it a little bit better further because the brush strokes don't break apart. But it's got some. And what happened is that Philemon, as he's pouring the wine, right, kept looking down at his pitcher, and it never got empty. Like he'd pour him wine, he'd still have wine. Pour him wine, it was a miracle, right? And he says, "What's going on here? I keep giving you guys all my, and I'm trying to give you all, but I still got some wine." And at that point, the gods revealed their true character to him. We have worked this miracle for you. Because out of the goodness of your heart you have given us this, we will make sure that we do not take the last of your wine. And so what we're seeing here is the moment when Zeus and Hermes are revealed to be gods, not people. And what do Philemon and Baucis do? They're very, very humbled by this. Right? Again, Rembrandt's interest in characterization, a wonderful couple on the left. Zeus in the middle with his armor being lit up, right? That's revealing who he is, the king of the gods in heaven, and all that shiny armor is part of his character. He's got a goose on his lap because that's it's his symbol, right? It's the swan is Zeus's own symbol. So now we see the thing that identifies him. And then there's that wonderful light that gives Hermes the sense of having a halo behind it, right? And the light that he uses, that Caravaggio-like light that Rembrandt uses, is meant to be the revelation of divinity in the picture, right? So, again, Rembrandt is a storyteller. That's what he wants to do, is to tell sort of an engaging story. And almost all of the other works that he does lead up to this, allow him to become a person who can tell this story in a human and engaging way. Now, for my money, Rembrandt's best pictures are his etchings. Etching is another form of printmaking, right? We've talked a lot about printmaking in this class, right? And you can probably tell I quite like printmaking. So we've talked about woodcut, right? And we talked about engraving so far, right? And remember that woodcut, you cut away the valleys and run the ink on the top of the mountains. And you put a piece of paper on it and it transfers from the mountaintops to the paper, right? Engraving, you cut away the valleys and push ink down into the valleys, and you pull the ink out of that, right? So you had to carve the plate with these little lines, right? And as we talked before, I think I brought something in here, right? It's difficult, it's hard, right? Because you're pushing a piece of steel through a piece of copper, right? Very, very difficult, easy to cut yourself, right? Etching gets those lines just like engraving, but it gets them in a different way. What you do with etching is, instead of carving with a sharp tool, you cover this part of the plate with a thin layer of wax. You then scratch through the wax with a needle. So it's not metal on metal, it's metal on wax. Easy peasy, right? It's like cutting butter. And then you put it in a bath of acid. And the acid carves those lines wherever you had scratched through the wax. But because wax doesn't emit water, and acid is a liquid bath, right? It won't go through the wax. Does that make sense? So you get the same sort of lines, but what you do is you simply draw on the surface through the wax, and then you immerse it in the acid to cut the lines. It makes it much, much easier to actually scribble, if you will. So this is what Rembrandt has in etching. It's still a copper plate that he's manipulated, rubbed ink into the lines that he's made chemically now, and polished off the surfaces, run it through a press to pull the ink out of the lines and onto the paper. So you can have multiple impressions from the same matrix. For Rembrandt, this is important. For anybody, this is important because it allows you to get a lot of art from one product. Whereas a painting is a one-off, right? You're done. You only sell one of those, right? But with prints, as long as you got the plate, you can keep selling them. And Rembrandt was really savvy when it came to marketing his prints. He would wipe each one of them slightly differently. He would leave more tone in certain places than others. He would make subtle little changes, knowing that people would want to collect them all, right? So it wasn't enough to own one of these. You'd want to own 3 or 4 of them because each one looked a little bit different. Now, it's called the 100 guilder print. A guilder is $1 in 17th century Holland. And it's called the 100 guilder print because a collector paid 100 guilders for one of these ones during Rembrandt's lifetime, or so the story goes. And that was an extraordinary amount to pay for a print at that time. There's even some rumor that Rembrandt was the one who bought it in order to drive the prices for his prints up to set the precedent. We have no proof for that, right? But that's why it's called the 100 guilder print, okay? Because it sold for so much. Now, what's the subject matter here? You can tell it's Jesus, right? We've got a religious image, but it's not just Jesus on the cross, right? It's a story from his life, a very human story from the life of Christ. This is the moment, and now we can start to see some of the etched lines, right? This is the moment from the book of Matthew, chapter 19, where the sick and the dying are brought to Christ after he's been preaching at the Sea of Galilee. To heal them, exactly right. And what Rembrandt has chosen is a sort of human interaction around that. So now, it's all about Christ healing the sick, but you'll notice that nobody's getting up, right? We have a woman bringing a baby to Jesus here. What a cute little baby, right? Bringing the baby to Jesus. We have another woman lame on the ground, more here on their knees praying. Somebody being brought in a wheelbarrow over here, right? The sick and the dying are being brought to Christ for healing, and it's kind of got Caravaggio lighting, even though it's a print. He's got a halo, and he's about to gesture, and it's all about the human interaction in this miraculous story, right? So, what Rembrandt focuses on are certain elements from Matthew 19 that focuses on this human interaction. One of them is, verse 13 says, the disciples spoke sternly to the people who brought the sick and dying. And Jesus said to him, to the disciple, right? Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs. Right? So that becomes the focal point for Rembrandt. Him telling the disciples, don't stop the kids. Let the children come. Right? And you see what he does as he's about to welcome them. In one single gesture, he pushes back one of his apostles. Probably St. Peter, right here, right? With his hand. Get out of the way, let them come in. It's human interchange. It's human interaction. That sensitivity to humanity, that ability to characterize, is picked up by the Sanhedrin off to the left, the Jewish priests, sort of grumbling and saying things like, he shouldn't be doing this on Sunday, right? And look at how well he can characterize all of these different figures that are off to the left. I love the little kid with the butt patch on his trousers, and that dog. Is that the greatest dog ever? Look what the dog is doing. Can you tell? He's playing fetch. He's dropped the rock or whatever. He wants somebody to throw it, right? And it's like, no, not now. Right? Nobody will pay attention. And he's wagging his tail, right? He can't wait to play. Now, in this detail, we also see something else. Later in that same chapter of Matthew 19, Jesus said to the young man that was there was a young man amongst the people around him. He said to this young man, if you wish to be perfect, go and sell your possessions and give your money to the poor. And you will have treasure in heaven, and then you can come and follow me. Again, from the Bible, when the young man heard this word, he went away grieving because he had many possessions. He didn't want to sell everything to follow Jesus. Can you find him there? Right? Directly behind the woman is this man leaning on his hand, and you can see he's very nicely dressed. Look at the embroidery on that, right? And he's lamenting the fact that he has so many possessions, and Christ wants him to give everything up to follow him. So, telling this story as a series of human interchanges, right, is Rembrandt's incredible strength. On the other side, there's another lame person being brought on a wheelbarrow before Christ and again, gestures, people looking every direction. A blind man, you see somebody's helping him by leading him by the hand on his stick being offered. And in the background, a camel. And this is kind of the funny part, because that Bible verse ends, after the young man can't give up his possessions, right? Rembrandt says to him, again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for the rich to enter heaven, right? And Rembrandt takes this at face value and just sticks a camel in there, right? To remind us of that biblical verse. So it's somewhat humorous, but it's also really an interesting way of bringing to life this entire chapter through a series of human interchanges. One of Rembrandt's fantastic strengths, right? Well, it's almost 6:15. I got two more Rembrandts to show you because I think he's so good, right? But we're looking at it because Rembrandt didn't specialize, okay? This is, I think we'll end with this, right? We've seen that Rembrandt always wanted to be, and really put great value in becoming a history painter. Well, he did, and that's what he did most, right? But we see also that he did portraits. He did one still life, right? But he also did landscapes, and particularly in print. And so that's what we'll look at the beginning of class. And then we're going to move on to France and move into the 18th and 19th century. We're going to be moving pretty quickly here, up to speed here, right? So there's another worksheet coming down the pike, but I won't have it due before your progress report, right? I don't want to muddy the waters with that, okay? So I've got a little bit more work to do on it before it's ready to be given to you guys, but it won't be due this week. Okay? I'll see you guys on Thursday, and whatever you do, if you're not done with the progress report, don't cut class, right? That just makes your life worse, right? It's due by email, and I'll take it after class is over on Thursday. Come to class if you're not done with it yet.